All right, well, I think I might get started now. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today for the first in our three-part webinar series from the Olive Wellness Institute. My name is Sian Armstrong. I'm a dietitian and I work at the Olive Wellness Institute, and I'm going to be your host for today. So before we begin, the Olive Wellness Institute would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So before I introduce you to our wonderful speakers, I'll quickly just run through some housekeeping items. After our presentation today, we are going to have some time for a Q&A with our speakers. So if you have any questions, could you please pop them into the Q&A box and not the chat box? We won't be answering any of the questions from the chat, so please do enter them into the Q&A. And if your question is for a specific presenter, it would be great if you could also just add their name so I can know who to address it to. Our webinar today is being recorded, so we will shortly have that uploaded to the Olive Wellness Institute website, and I'll also make sure that it's emailed out to you if you've attended or all those who aren't attending as well. Okay, so let's talk about today's exciting topic of food and mood. The evidence linking mental health and diet has grown steadily over the last few years, and we know now that what we eat can impact both our mood and our risk of mental health conditions. The Mediterranean diet has emerged as one of the best eating patterns for mental health, with studies showing links to improvements in depression and anxiety symptoms, as well as links to a decreased risk of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So we are so lucky today to hear from two expert guest speakers, Dr. Wolfgang Marx and Dr. Hannah Mayr. So firstly, we will be hearing from Dr. Wolfgang Marx. Dr. Marx is an NHMRC emerging leader and multiple sclerosis Research Australia postdoctoral research fellow at the Food and Mood Centre, where he leads the nutraceutical research stream. Wolfgang is also an executive member of the International Society for Nutritional Psychiatry Research and an honorary research fellow at the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health at La Trobe University and Bond University. Wolfgang's current research program covers a broad range of projects involving the use of nutraceuticals and functional foods for mental health, fatigue, and cognition. Of particular interest is the role of polyphenols in the brain health and gut microbiome. I'll also quickly introduce our second speaker, Dr. Hannah Mayr, and then I'll pass over to Dr. Marx to begin the presentation. So Dr. Mayr is an accredited practicing dietitian and has expertise as a clinical researcher in chronic disease prevention and management with a food as medicine mantra. Her work has a focus on evidence-based dietary patterns. Hannah received the Dietitians Australia Early Career Researcher Award in 2018 for her PhD work investigating a Mediterranean-style diet intervention. Hannah works as a research fellow and dietitian in Metro South Hospital and Health Service in Brisbane, where she collaborates with a diverse team of medical and allied health clinician researchers. She's currently leading a project focusing on translating evidence for a Mediterranean-style diet approach into routine care for people with type 2 diabetes and heart disease. Hannah is a guest lecturer in the Bond University Master of Nutrition and Dietetic Practice and regularly educates multidisciplinary clinicians on evidence-based approaches. All right, so let's kick it off with our first presenter, Dr. Marx. So you've already got your video on, which is great. I will ask you to please share your screen and I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Sian. Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Dr. Wolfgang Marx. As introduced, I'm an NHMRC Emerging Fellow and Senior Research Fellow at Deakin's Food and Mood Centre. It's an absolute pleasure to present today, and thank you to the organisers of this event for having me on today. I guess as the title of this presentation suggests, I want to provide you with an overview of the current evidence that link our diet and the food that we eat to our mental health, particularly with a focus on depression. I also want to focus particularly on what we know regarding the role of polyphenols in our mental health and emerging evidence around polyphenol-rich foods, including extra virgin olive oil. So many of you may be aware of some of the evidence in the field of nutritional psychiatry. And I think despite it being a relatively young field, there's really been an enormous amount of research in this area that's been conducted to date. So let's start with an overview of nutritional psychiatry as a whole and where the current evidence stands. We now have considerable epidemiological evidence from diverse data sets that show that diet quality is associated with our risk of depression. This is shown both in cross-sectional and prospective or longitudinal studies. The slide up at the moment, these are the primary results from a recent meta-analysis that some of our colleagues published that show that various healthy diet indices demonstrate a greater, including a greater adherence to a Mediterranean diet, as well as a diet low in the dietary inflammatory index score, is associated with approximately 30% reduced risk of depression. Now, while much of the evidence to date, I guess in terms of the observational literature, has been in adult data sets, it should also be noted that there are many studies demonstrating similar associations across the lifespan. There are many studies that have reported an association between diet quality and mental health in adolescents. One of the studies that came out of our group, published by Professor Felice Chaka, our co-director, showed that a lower adherence to the consumption of foods promoted by the dietary guidelines was associated with increased odds of depressive symptoms in adolescents. We've also since then recently published a systematic literature review, which I guess corroborates some of these earlier studies. Interestingly, there's also a potential association between the maternal diet, or the diet that mothers eat during pregnancy, and internalizing and externalizing behaviors in infants. So again, one of the studies that looked at this that came out of our lab, published by Felice Chaka, this was in 23,000 Norwegian women and their children. This was followed in a prospective cohort. And they found that a higher intake of these sort of processed, unhealthy foods during pregnancy predicted these externalizing behaviors. So things like aggression in children, which was independent of potentially confounding factors such as the childhood diet. They also found that children with a high level of these same unhealthy dietary patterns postnatally had higher levels of internalizing, that being fearfulness, social withdrawal, as well as externalizing problems. Moving beyond observational analysis, we also have a growing evidence from randomized controlled trials, which suggests that improved diet quality is not necessarily simply associated with a lower risk of depression, but this relationship may be causal. So this was a meta-analysis that was conducted by us and colleagues that looked at randomized controlled trials, largely in people that were not clinically depressed, which demonstrated a small but significant reduction in depressive symptoms after following a dietary intervention. Furthermore, we also have a growing number of studies that looked at the effect of dietary interventions in people with clinical depression too. So this was our SMILES trial. This is one of the first studies to explore the use of a dietary intervention within a randomized controlled trial study design in people with clinical depression. We recruited 67 adults with clinical depression. Participants were randomized to either receive a 12-week individualized nutritional counseling that encouraged participants to adhere to a Mediterranean-style diet, or they received, or they were randomized to receive a non-dietary sort of social support intervention. Here's an overview of the dietary principles that we discussed with the participants. Key messages being the reduction of processed and discretionary foods, while increasing the intake of oily fish, legumes, vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and using extra virgin olive oil as the primary source of fat. And while the depressive symptoms improved in both the diet group and the social support group compared to baseline, those who followed the modified Mediterranean-style diet had a much lower level of depression at the end of this 12-week trial. So much so that at the 12-week time point, using formal clinical diagnostic criteria, 32% of those within the diet group achieved remission criteria. I also wanted to point out this interesting figure from our study, which looked at the level of adherence to the intervention and change in depressive symptoms. And what we see is, I guess, what you could call a dose-response relationship, more or less, where we see that those that adhered, had greater adherence to the Mediterranean-style diet showed a greater reduction in symptoms. And what's really, I guess, exciting about this area is that there are now a number of other randomized controlled trials run by other groups within Australia that have essentially replicated these findings. So both of these interventions were randomized controlled trials, people with clinical depression, and used a Mediterranean-style diet as the intervention. So these data provide, I guess, compelling evidence that a healthy dietary pattern can beneficially affect depressive symptoms. And when presented with this data, I guess one of the next questions that you might ask is, well, what is it about a healthy diet that is responsible for this beneficial effect? Because indeed, there are a whole host of different bioactive compounds within our diet that are implicated in the various mechanisms of action that are related to our mental health. A prominent example is omega-3 fatty acids. This is a set of compounds that have been very well explored in terms of brain development, brain function, as well as depression management. Dietary fiber has this renewed interest due to the role of the gut microbiome. The list goes on, but I think one of the exciting and emerging areas is the role of polyphenols. These are compounds that are present across, I guess, diverse, I guess, all plant foods, and are highly abundant in healthy dietary patterns. So we're not just talking about fruits, vegetables, spices, these sorts of things, but also, I guess, products that are derived from these plant foods. So things like red wine and extra virgin olive oil. So let's talk about this. So to begin, let's talk about some of the observational data sets and what we're seeing from those studies. So if we look at the consumption of polyphenol-rich food items, beverages such as tea and coffee, I think are probably the most well investigated. On the slide, there are two meta-analyses, both of which found a higher consumption of these beverages were associated with a reduced risk of depressive symptoms. But there are also other individual studies that have investigated various food items, things like soy consumption, legumes, nuts, extra virgin olive oil, that have also found similar associations. There are also a growing number of studies that have looked at polyphenol intake, or I guess whole of diet polyphenol intake, rather than focusing on specific polyphenol-rich food items, which I think is a helpful addition to the literature, because, we don't just eat one specific food, we eat, a diet. And so I think this gives a more representative image of, I guess, the overall polyphenol consumption and its role in mental health. And so these were two recent examples. One was a cross-sectional study. Another was a 10-year prospective study within the nurses' health study cohort. Both studies found that individual polyphenol subclasses were associated with a reduced risk of depressive symptoms or incidents. And I do want to flag that we're continuing this work at the moment with one of our PhD students who is looking at a similar study design, but within the Australian context, which hasn't been explored previously. So the observational data, I guess, as I sort of briefly touched on, this provides this emerging but so far consistent association between a higher intake of polyphenol-rich foods, or a high intake of, I guess, whole of diet polyphenol intake, and a reduction in depressive symptoms. But of course, we need to conduct clinical interventions to determine the, I guess, the causal nature of these associations. If we start with individual polyphenols and polyphenol rich food items, I think probably one of the most well-studied polyphenols for depression is curcumin. This is a meta-analysis that included people with elevated depressive symptoms or clinical depression. And as you can see from the top forest plot, the overall meta-analysis, as well as the, I guess, many of the individual studies included, favor the use of curcumin compared to a placebo control. They also had a second meta-analysis looking at anxiety symptoms, which was in a subset of the same studies, which showed similar patterns. But I guess to me, while these are promising outcomes, and it's great to see this in a randomized controlled trial context, I think it's important to consider that these are relatively small sample sizes. And I think particularly due to the effect size reported in these meta-analyses, I think it suggests to me that we need some larger studies to replicate these results. Cocoa is another polyphenol-rich food item that I want to include because who doesn't love chocolate? And this has been investigated for its effect on depression-related outcomes. These are the results of a recent systematic review and meta-analysis, which showed a reduction in both depressive and anxiety symptoms compared to the control interventions. But I do, again, want to sort of highlight that these were relatively short duration. Many of these were, acute sort of feeding studies, very heterogeneous clinical samples and study designs. And so while I'd like to think chocolate is medicinal, I think we need some further studies to just corroborate this evidence. There's also a smaller number of studies that investigated various other polyphenol interventions and have showed improvement in depressive or mood outcomes. These have largely been conducted in healthy participants rather than people with clinical depression. For example, we conducted recent meta-analyses and reviews on blueberry and blueberry polyphenol interventions, as well as resveratrol, a prominent polyphenol within grapes and red wine. There are also individual trials that suggest interventions such as chamomile and soy products may also provide some benefit. But I wanted to zoom in on this study that was actually published earlier this year. So to my knowledge, this is the first randomized controlled trial that looked at the effect of extra virgin olive oil directly within the clinical trial context in people with major depressive disorder. This was a 7-week intervention in 73 people with major depressive disorder. They were randomized to receive either 25 ml of extra virgin olive oil per day or a soybean oil a control condition. They looked at the effect on depressive symptoms using widely used validated self-reported questionnaires, and they found that the olive oil intervention resulted in this significant improvement in depressive symptoms. And when they ran some subgroup analyses, they found that this was particularly strong within the group that had severe depressive symptoms at baseline. They also looked at a number of biomarkers to try and tease out what the mechanisms of action of this might be. They looked at salivary cortisol as well as BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor. They didn't find any significant findings there, which I guess suggests that maybe there's other mechanisms of action at play. Nevertheless, I think this is a really interesting and well-conducted study. I think this is I guess it's a promising start. Obviously, these results need to be replicated in future interventions, but I do wanted to highlight that there's now this emerging evidence that's not just various other polyphenol-rich food items. The effect of extra virgin olive oil has also been investigated. So I guess similar to what I raised before, when we see the data as a whole around the role of polyphenols and their effect on our mental health and depressive, we see this emerging but so far consistent pattern to demonstrate that polyphenols, various polyphenol-rich food items, as well as whole of diet and subclasses may be an effective intervention for depressive symptoms. And I guess the next question that I have is, well, if these polyphenols are showing benefit, how are they doing this? What are the implicated mechanisms? What are they acting through to improve our mental health? So we conducted a large review of, I guess, this area more broadly that was recently published in Molecular Psychiatry that aimed to sort of tease apart what are the various implicated mechanisms within our diet and how do these relate to depression. This was a figure from our manuscript. We identified a number of various mechanisms of action. These include the modulation of pathways like inflammation, oxidative stress, mitochondrial dysfunction, the gut microbiome, kynurenine metabolism. There's a whole range of these. And obviously, I don't have time to go through all of these in this presentation, but I guess I do want to point out one thing, which is that for all of these mechanisms, there were either dietary polyphenol-rich food items or polyphenol subclasses that seem to have a role in a number of these pathways, which I think suggests that it's unlikely that polyphenols are acting through any one pathway, but rather they have a variety of different properties that may be modulating through a variety of different pathways. Having said that, I do wanted to touch on two areas that I think are particularly promising and have this growing evidence base, and that you may not be as aware of, or that may have a lot of sort of rapidly developing research. So the first one is the gut microbiome, because that's kind of the hot topic right now. This is an intense area of research, as well as clinical and public health, public interest. I guess we also know the spiel about gut microbiome. There's trillions of bacteria in us, so we're more bacteria than people, et cetera, et cetera. So I won't go into that, but I do want to sort of touch on this really interesting relationship that polyphenols have with our gut microbiome, in that it's understood to be a bidirectional relationship, in that polyphenols not only appear to have the strong prebiotic property that selectively improve beneficial gut bacteria within our gut microbiome. So by consuming polyphenol-rich food items, it seems to improve our gut microbiome composition, but it's this metabolism of polyphenols by the gut microbiome that appear to be responsible for the beneficial properties seen with polyphenol consumption. And so I guess just to sort of tease that out, I think this is a really interesting figure from an animal study. So let me just bring up my pointer. So to sort of walk you through this was a study where they gave one group of mice a high-fat diet and measured their blood glucose tolerance. And they found this spike in blood glucose after this challenge. They then had a separate group that gave the same high-fat diet, but with black currant polyphenols. And when they did that, they see this really blunted response. And so I guess the implication is that polyphenols might be able to improve some of the blood glucose management and might have that as a potential intervention. But what's interesting is that they then did a separate group that gave the same high-fat diet, the same blackcurrant polyphenols, but then they gave these mice an antibiotic, which essentially wiped out their gut microbiome. And when they did that, they see that all these like beneficial effects from these black currants were essentially wiped out, and they see this really increased response in blood glucose. And so I think that just illustrates, at least to me, that the relationship between polyphenols and gut microbiome seems to be a really important aspect to their beneficial properties. The last thing I just wanted to quickly touch on is the role of the tryptophan kynurenine pathway. So this is an area that's maybe not as well understood and has received as much interest as the gut microbiome. But essentially, it's this pathway that we have demonstrated within a recent large meta-analysis over 101 studies, 10,000 participants, that showed that various metabolites along this pathway seem to be implicated in depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. And what's interesting is that we now have, really in the last couple of years, emerging in vitro and animal studies, as well as intervention and observational studies, which show that a variety of different polyphenol-rich food items, as well as individual polyphenols, appear to affect multiple points along this pathway. And so one of the research questions that we're investigating in some of our upcoming trials is, well, do these polyphenols beneficially modulate this kynurenine pathway? And then does this modulation then improve depressive symptoms? And I guess just to sort of wrap up or tie some of these concepts together, I think this is a really interesting study. So this was an animal study where mice received a high-fat diet, which disrupted their gut microbiome. In a separate group of these mice, they received these blackberry polyphenol supplement, and they found that when this group received this high-fat diet, these blackberry polyphenols actually counteracted some of this disruption seen in the gut microbiome, and that this change in gut microbiome composition was related to anti-inflammatory properties within the brain, and that these anti-inflammatory properties were found to be modulated by this kynurenine pathway. And so I think that sort of ties together that all these various pathways, they're not all working in silos, they're working together, and it's this sort of synergistic effect that's occurring. To wrap up, I just wanted to flag that we've designed a free online course on nutritional psychiatry that is aimed towards the general public. So if you're interested in learning more, please find us on Google. I wanted to thank our team at the Food and Mood Center. If this presentation has inspired you to pursue some further research in polyphenols or interested in the area, we're always looking for talented PhD students and research fellows. So please contact us if you're interested in working with us. And if you're interested in knowing more or following along with our work, please feel free to follow us on our website as well as our social media. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll now hand over to Dr. Hannah Mayr.
Thank you, Wolf. I will just share my screen. Few seconds. Okay, so thank you so much for your earlier introduction, Sian. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to present as part of today's webinar. And thank you so much, Wolf, for your prior excellent presentation. And I think it's so great to see the evidence that has emerged in the last few years in this space, and so exciting to see where we're going to get to in terms of, these polyphenol studies, etc., that are yet to come and understand more about. So my presentation today is going to be less focused on understanding of where evidence is at, but more focused on the concept of translating the Mediterranean dietary pattern, or med diet as I will call it, from research to practice. So what will I cover in my presentation? So I'm briefly going to refer to the research evidence that exists that supports a Mediterranean diet across multiple health outcomes. And then I'm going to share findings from my own recent studies that explore whether that evidence has actually been translated into routine care. And I'll also then cover what can we potentially be doing to better support implementation of this approach across members of a multidisciplinary team. I'll finally then cover off some more practical translation aspects, including the core dietary principles, and to actually direct you to some resources that you can hopefully use to support your clinical practice or share with others. I just also wanted to disclose that I am involved in the Olive Oz trial, and this study received funding and in-kind support from Cobram Estate. So by no means do I have the scope to direct you today to the many studies and reviews that have evaluated a Mediterranean diet across really diverse health outcomes, especially chronic conditions. However, this umbrella review that was published in 2018 synthesizes Mediterranean diet meta-analyses and provides a really excellent example. So they reviewed meta-analyses from 13 observational studies and 16 from RCTs and had total population of over 12 million subjects. So this review of reviews essentially found that there was very high level evidence that greater adherence to a Mediterranean diet can reduce risk of overall mortality, coronary heart disease, heart attack, cancer incidence, neurodegenerative diseases, as well as diabetes. They also showed from meta-analyses that there was a significant reduced risk of depression. Now, what we've seen from Wolf's presentation is that since this data was published, there's been emergence of some really promising randomized control trials showing that a Mediterranean diet can reduce symptoms or even reverse depression. So given the multitude of studies that we have that support the benefits of a Mediterranean diet, this has then meant that it has been included in a really large range of practice guidelines, position statements, and review papers. So I've included a few examples on this slide, including those in the areas of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, fatty liver disease, and also more recently, reviews and papers around depression and mood disorders. So each of these examples of papers include the recommendation to promote use of a Mediterranean dietary pattern in the prevention or management of those chronic conditions. But does this evidence actually mean that this dietary approach is being used in routine care? We know that it can take a really substantial time for research evidence to be translated into clinicians' practice. And this is especially evident in the context of a Mediterranean dietary pattern. And given that, many of the studies that have been conducted have been done in Mediterranean countries. And also those that have been conducted in Australia that have shown effectiveness as well as feasibility have typically been done in pretty small controlled trial settings and also have been conducted by specifically trained dietitians. So I have recently conducted a number of studies to understand to what extent has this translation occurred in our own settings. So firstly, I was involved in conducting a national survey of dietitians. So this was administered in November 2019. So we were able to capture 200 dietitians in Australia that were managing patients either with CVD, type 2 diabetes, or fatty liver disease. And they came from any setting. So they were in both public and private settings. And we had 3/4 mostly worked in outpatient or community settings, and 1/4 worked in acute or subacute settings. So what were some of the key findings we had in terms of gaps between the existing med diet evidence and practice? So what we found was that greater than 80% of the dietitians working with patients in diabetes and fatty liver disease, and greater than 90% in heart disease, agreed or strongly agreed that evidence supports recommending this diet approach. However, in terms of actual use in routine counselling of these patients, the dietary approach was used around 1/3 of the time in diabetes and fatty liver disease, and just less than half in heart disease. Routinely recommending this dietary pattern was actually significantly associated with clinicians who had a greater number of years of experience in practice, and very interestingly, those who acknowledged they personally follow this type of diet. We also found that there would be some enablers that could help support use in practice. So this included things like greater access to evidence summaries, in-person and online practical PD, and more consumer-friendly and accessible practical resources to give patients. The barriers that were also identified were things like having limited consultation time and limited numbers of consults with patients. Some dietitians said that they felt it was inappropriate to recommend a specific diet, and also didn't want to stray away from the Australian guidelines. And also it came up that this type of dietary approach was not really being consistently used within course content of dietetics courses. So when implementing evidence, we know that it's also really important to understand the barriers and enablers within a local health service context. And this led me to also leading a body of work where we interviewed clinicians from across the large Brisbane Metro South Health Service that I work in. So in this service, from 3 hospitals and 8 community health centres, I recruited a large number of clinicians who were routinely managing patients with either coronary heart disease, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, or after having a kidney or liver transplant. And so I should acknowledge here that we didn't specifically recruit clinicians working with patients with mental health conditions. However, we do know that in these chronic conditions that we focused on, mood disorders such as depression are very common comorbidity for these patients. So you can see across the slide there that we recruited a large number of clinicians from across various disciplines. And in terms of the research approach, we looked at this data using a process of thematic analysis. So we obtained really rich data across the disease specialties and professions, and it actually led us to dividing the analysis in a number of different ways. So here I'm just directing you to 3 papers that we've published from the interviews if you're looking further into those methods or the findings. But today I'll now just share with you some of the key themes that we found from across these different analyses. So what were some of the key barriers to a med diet approach being used in practice? So from a clinician-centered point of view, we found that people said they very much believed that this diet was likely to be healthy and it was trusted, but in general, many people were really lacking an understanding of concrete evidence that supported its use. Many acknowledged that they had insufficient knowledge and practice skills. There really was a legacy of single nutrient or more restriction-focused dietary recommendations. And this also was connected to the fact that there were a lot of traditional disease silos in recommendations. So you can see on the slide some quotes. So a dietitian has acknowledged, I'm a bit slippery on what this diet is and that it can be hard to get a definition. Then a cardiac nurse talks about how they feel the general education they should give to someone post a cardiac event is low fat, low cholesterol, and low salt. In terms of more patient-centered barriers they recognise, these were things like considering the broader socio-cultural context, barriers in terms of their lower health literacy, or addressing aspects like cost. What was also interesting was that across the clinicians, there tended to be this overall lack of belief in the capability that patients would be able to change or follow this diet approach. And this meant that the clinicians actually didn't even recommend it because they just thought, well, they're never going to follow it anyway. So you can see a quote there from an endocrinologist talking about, for many patients, it's just not their food, there's great cultural diversity, and also that perception around this type of diet being more expensive. What about what would be enablers to this approach being used in practice more? So the clinicians acknowledged that their knowledge and skills can be improved if they had more specific education and training. They also recognised that there's a broader impact on what they recommend in practice based on the department culture and whether or not there are any local protocols or direction, and that more, I guess, team or social influence-based approach. There was also the concept that there could be much more knowledge exchange happening from dietitians within multidisciplinary teams. And also that current clinic tools and resources didn't really necessarily promote this type of approach, and that would help clinicians to do it more. So you can see some quotes on the slide. A hepatologist has talked about the fact that we need greater consistency across clinicians, and having things like in-services and upskilling is a really important role of dietitians in addition to seeing patients. Also, some clinicians raise the fact that it can also provide something to follow for patients. And so it actually could be more useful in that sense compared to previous types of dietary recommendations that were more general. And also this concept was raised that if you focus more on diet quality, then it allows you to use a more Mediterranean style approach. And you can see a dietitian quoted there saying that the Mediterranean diet, it can be easier to catch on to, and that saying things like Australian Guide to Healthy Eating might just sound boring and official to patients. The final quote I've got on the slide there comes from a cardiologist, and essentially just acknowledges that they would be seeking access to tools or guidelines to help step patients through, this is the type of thing you do to follow this approach. But they've also said there that they themselves would be seeking some simple steps on how they could help recommend this more with patients. So very briefly, I wanted to touch on some theory behind this. So when we analysed the data, we applied what's known as the theoretical domains framework. And this helps us understand what are the broader influences on why or why not clinicians use this approach in practice. And you can see one of the key domains related to skills and knowledge, which we may have expected. But what's really important to acknowledge that there are broader influencing factors. So things like the environmental context and resources. So the broader service culture, the models of care, and access and resourcing are key. Also, professional role and identity. So there is a broader role across professions in terms of providing dietary education to patients. And the dietitians could play a bigger role in being an expert or educator. And also that concept of beliefs about consequences, and really trying to figure out, can we have the clinicians shift their headspace that this can be possible in their patients? So the health service that I work in, we are actually currently in the phase of utilising the data that we've collected to actually create implementation strategies that address a lot of those barriers and enablers that were identified. So I thought I could share some of the examples with you of what we're doing in that local context. So we're doing things like recruiting clinical champions and opinion leaders from across disciplines and sites. We're working towards empowering dietitians more to deliver education sessions on this dietary approach, and that requires upskilling of dietitians in the first place as well. Utilising things like teaching things about core evidence, what are gaps in practice, and what are top practical tips. We're also working towards better embedding this approach within existing clinic tools and easy to access information materials. We're engaging consumers in the process. So, for example, having them involved in the development of education materials. And we're also doing things that allow us to embed this more in ongoing information that new clinicians would access. So caseload descriptions and orientation guidelines. So now that I've talked a bit about, we have really good evidence for this approach and there's barriers and enablers to us being able to use it in routine care, I'd like to talk to you about some more practical considerations that maybe would help you or you could pass on to other people that you work with. So this includes covering off some core dietary principles and then practical resources that could support your practice. So how does this Mediterranean dietary pattern compare to our Australian guidelines? So here's our typical Australian Guide to Healthy Eating showing its plate model with the core 5 food groups. Here against it is a common pictorial pyramid that's used to describe the foods within a Mediterranean diet pyramid. Now, there's a lot of overlap between these two, especially promotion of whole grain breads and cereals, fruits and vegetables. But what's really important to consider are some more specific food-based recommendations within the Med Diet pyramid that are not within our core food groups. So if we think about what these are, these include things like extra virgin olive oil, specifically promoting nuts and seeds, limiting red meat, so right at the top of the pyramid, promoting things like plant-based proteins like legumes, inclusion of fish and seafood, and things like fermented dairy foods. What we also see along the bottom is that there's that promotion of lifestyle behaviours, including aspects like eating meals together. So what are some top 10 Mediterranean style eating principles? So these will align a lot with the pyramid that Wolf showed you from the SMILES trial, but this just puts it into, I guess, some simple language to consider. And I guess when you look at these Mediterranean style eating principles, I would challenge you to think, well, how does this compare to some of the more traditional approaches we might use in practice, like nutrient-based recommendations, or even our Australian Guide to Healthy Eating that only has 5 broader core foods. So you can see these top tips focus specifically on extra virgin olive oil, vegetables, inclusion of legumes, fish or seafood, that lesser amount of red meat, daily fruit, choosing dairy and particularly fermented forms, whole grain breads and cereals. Portions and frequencies of this should really depend on someone's clinical background and may differ if they have diabetes. Optional inclusion of red wine in small amounts and with meals, and then also specific inclusion of nuts and using that as a snack in comparison to traditional type snacks like sweets and commercial products. So I know that often clinicians in practice like to use a plate model that helps to show food recommendations, but at the same time recommending portion sizes. So this is just a Mediterranean style lens on a portion plate. And what you'll notice that differs to maybe some of the traditional models is that it has a few additions. So specifically including extra virgin olive oil on the plate so that it's considered to be a core part of a meal. Adding things like flavouring meals with herbs and spices. And then also in terms of the protein recommendations, using language like fish, legumes and poultry or eggs, and sometimes red meat. Also helps plant that seed of which types of protein sources are the healthiest. Another way you can look at this approach is to think about the diet as a plant to animal ratio. So a traditional Mediterranean diet has a ratio of plants about 4:1 animal foods. And you can see an example picture on the slide here that shows you that breakdown of the meal on a plate where you've got 80% from plant foods and about 20% animal. And the amount of red meat on that plate really is small. So this just helps us think, compared to the typical Australian diet, which is more like a 2:1 ratio, this is an example way you could get people to look at the food that they're eating. I also wanted to make specific mention to promoting extra virgin olive oil. And as Wolf touched on this, there's some really great emerging evidence that promotes the use of extra virgin olive oil specifically. And this is partly because of the polyphenol content, as well as things like the monounsaturated fats and vitamins like vitamin E. Now, in a Mediterranean style diet, this is actually one of the core dietary principles that differs to other dietary patterns. Some important tips to consider are that light olive oil does not mean it has less calories. It means it's actually more refined, has lower flavor and polyphenols. Olive oil margarines are typically only about 20% olive oil. So you really should be promoting use of the actual oil rather than those products. A really common myth that I encourage you to bust widely is that you can use extra virgin olive oil in cooking. And I've put a link on the slide here. The Olive Wellness Institute has some great, readings about this that show the science that it is actually stable when cooked with. The final tip I would have is choose Australian varieties, because we actually have standards that don't have to be met if it's an imported oil. And I've shown on the slide a symbol there that you can actually look for that shows if the oil has been certified as extra virgin in Australia. So now I'm just going to finish up with some direction to some practical resources. I'm not going to go through them in too much depth. They're really just here to show you where I think you could go to if you want to know more about the practical application and also accessing resources for patients. So Dr. Eleanor George led this paper that I was involved in. It describes the development of a med diet model that complies with traditional practices of the diet, but it's about applying it in a multi-ethnic context. And the supplementary material published with this paper has patient education resources with it that we used in our dietary trials. So it also has a concept of how you can translate the traditional Greek Mediterranean cuisine across different cultural examples and meals. And so you can see an example on the slide there of a Greek dish translated across a range of different cultural patterns. Now, Wolf talked a lot about the SMILES trial, so I just wanted to direct you to this specific paper that Dr. Rochelle Opie published that actually goes into a lot of detail about what their dietary protocol was. So it has a food pyramid and it has really detailed information on what was actually conducted in the sessions. And this was specific to doing this in a population with major depression. And that paper also has supplementary material that has patient education resources. So including meal ideas, meal plans, healthy snacks, goal setting, and checklists. So in terms of cost, I also just wanted to share with you that in the SMILES trial, they did a cost modelling study from a subset of participants. They actually found that the cost of food per person in the control condition was more than what the cost of food per person in the med diet intervention. So this just gives you an idea that a lot of the time the perception around this type of diet being more expensive may not actually be the case when put into practice or compared to someone's usual eating. I also wanted to direct you to our NEMO resource. So this is nutrition education materials online, and I've put the link on the slide. So this Mediterranean style diet practice resource has a range of different aspects to it, and you can see some snippets here, including meal and snack ideas, food-based recommendations, the portion plate model, and links to further information. The Heart Foundation has also really reframed its guidelines recently, so I would suggest that you have a look on their website for their recommendations for a heart-healthy eating pattern, where really the recommendations they make align strongly with the principles of a Mediterranean dietary pattern. Baker IDI have also recently developed fact sheets, and I've put on the slide here the ones that I feel really align well to a Mediterranean style diet approach. So ones around making healthy meals, plating, and healthy snacks. These are some recommended books and recipes. I've also directed you to the Grains and Legumes Nutrition Council here, because a lot of people don't know how to use legumes. I also suggest you go to Old Ways, and I know there was a question in the Q&A about accessing recipes. So this is a really great one to go to, because you can use filters to go to quick and easy or affordable recipes. And Wolf has already mentioned the Food and Mood course. So the final thing I wanted to go through was just some reflections from clinicians that have been using this Mediterranean diet approach more in their practice since we've been doing our implementation work. So the clinicians are reporting that they are finding that they're focusing more on multiple health outcomes rather than isolated diseases. Their diet history has focused a lot less on nutrients and those broader core food groups, and actually has focused more on some of those more specific food recommendations, and that they're using that top 10 tips checklist with patients to help the patients identify the foods that they're doing well or could improve on. Shifting their nutrition diagnosis away from, say, nutrient approaches to more food-based diagnoses, focusing more on what to include in someone's diet rather than what to exclude. They're finding that the term Mediterranean style diet or eating is actually being well received by patients. The doctors and nurses said that handouts are useful, but having it easily accessible is absolutely essential if they're going to use it in their practice. And then also just finally that there can be challenges when people have limited follow-up with patients. And so whilst they're using this in their practice, in some instances, they find they're not really sure if patients are going away and following it, because in the public health service, unfortunately, there is often a lack of follow-up. So in summary, we know that a Mediterranean diet has evidence across multiple health outcomes, but this does not necessarily mean it's being used in routine care. We need to address and assess enablers and barriers and consider the broader role of a multidisciplinary team. I would challenge you to think about no longer using a traditional nutrient or restriction focus, assess and advise on some more specific evidence-based food principles, and hopefully you can use and share the practical food-focused materials that I have shown you today. So thank you so much for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to both Dr. Mayr and Dr. Marx. They were brilliant presentations. We are running out of time a little bit for our Q&A, so if you have to jump off, that's absolutely fine, but I might try and answer or ask a few questions to Dr. Mayr and Dr. Marx. This is recorded, so if you have to jump off, you can always have a look at the recording later if you want to see some of the answers to the questions. So I'll start with one of the first ones that came through to you, Wolf. It said, does red wine contain bioavailable or enough polyphenols to be of any benefit? And how much would you need to consume considering the drinking guidelines as well? So I'll hand over to you for that one, if you could give us a quick answer on that one.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really great question. I think that actually there's multiple sort of elements there. I think one of them is that I guess in the literature, there's been this concern of the low bioavailability of some of these polyphenols. And I think what's really interesting about that, now that we're learning about the gut microbiome, is that maybe the bioavailability actually doesn't matter so much. It might be that it's the metabolites that are occurring from this consumption of these polyphenols through our gut microbiota that might be related to its beneficial effect. I think, so that's one part. The other part is around the role of red wine. And I think the amount of resveratrol is, which is one of the most well studied polyphenols in that sort of space, is quite minute in red wine. And so you would have to drink quite a lot of red wine to achieve some of the doses that we're seeing in the intervention studies, which, given the alcohol content, is definitely not advisable. And then I think in terms of the role of red wine, in terms of general health, I'd be interested to get your opinion, Hannah, but I think it's really about where your baseline is. So, you know, if you're drinking relatively regularly throughout the week, you know, reducing that intake down to that, 100 ml preference to red wine, I think might be beneficial. But if you're a non-drinker, I don't think there's really any evidence to suggest that we should start drinking. So I think it's about that sort of individualized perspective.
Fantastic. I don't know if you had anything to add to that, Hannah. Yeah.
I would agree, and I think that it's a controversial component of a Mediterranean diet pattern, but I think the other aspect to it is being inclusion focused, is that a lot of people do choose to drink alcohol. So sometimes you're better off including it in the dietary recommendations and saying we recommend drinking this much, and choosing wine, which could have benefits, over being very restriction focused, knowing that people are potentially going to drink anyway. So it can be helpful to take that approach rather than being restrictive.
Yep, that's a great perspective. We also had a question come through for you, Hannah, that was asking what you think about the potential to use Mediterranean diet prescriptions in primary care or outpatient settings. So if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, so I think that it's really interesting, because I think that historically dietitians, especially as a dietitian myself, we are really steered away from prescription. And I think in some instances that is appropriate. So sometimes we work with patients where small changes over time is the best approach, and you work with them to set goals, and you might do that very, very incrementally. However, we do know that some people respond better to being instructed on a more overarching approach that tells them overall how would your diet look, gives them more specific food-based frequencies and serves, etc. And that gives them something to work towards. And that's typically when we do these RCTs of a Mediterranean diet intervention, we are typically more prescriptive than we are in usual care. And so I guess the other element to the question is definitely there's a role in primary care. We know that from the studies that have been conducted, the largest study of a Mediterranean diet was done in a primary prevention setting and showed really, really important impacts in terms of preventing heart disease, but also preventing incidence of diabetes. So there's definitely a role to play in both prevention and management of conditions. Whether or not you use a prescription focus should be patient dependent, but I think that we shouldn't stray away from using prescription where we think it's appropriate.
Yeah, I guess just to add to that from the sort of mental health perspective, we're currently developing international guidelines, I guess, around lifestyle interventions as a whole for mental health. And one of the sort of things that have really been developed, particularly in the UK recently, is the use of that sort of social prescribing model, where the doctor may prescribe an exercise intervention. I think there was a group in the US where it's prescription of essentially, here's a free pass to a national park to being involved in nature and green space. And so I think that sort of use of that sort of prescription model can open up pathways within the healthcare system that may not be sort of accessible before. So yeah, I think it's something that's I guess what Hannah was saying.
Great. Another quick question for you, Wolf, about the level of polyphenols. Is there a difference between the level of polyphenols in extra virgin olive oil versus olive oil?
Yeah, so Hannah, I think, sort of touched on that with the sort of various different types of olive oil and its level of processing. So, extra virgin olive oil, typically, if it's a good quality oil, will have the higher level of polyphenol content, and, the olive oil, or the light olive oil as it's branded, essentially more heavily processed, which removes that polyphenol fraction. So if you're looking for that high polyphenol content, it's typically you're looking for that extra virgin olive oil.
Great. We have another question here on how important are the meat, fish components of the Mediterranean diet to health benefits? How does a vegetarian or vegan version of the Mediterranean diet compare? So I'm not sure if that's directed at both of you. So maybe Hannah, will go to you first if you have anything to answer for that.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing to say that one of the biggest challenges with looking at overarching dietary patterns, and I guess the premise behind dietary patterns is that you ideally don't look at isolated components as much. It's more about the whole approach and, combination of different foods. So it's very hard to answer in isolation if someone didn't do those components, what would be the benefit. I guess one thing I will say is that a lot of the evidence from studies has shown that small improvements in dietary adherence can achieve large change. So everyone tends to improve their adherence in different ways, and that can still have large benefits. What we are definitely seeing coming out in the literature is that red and processed meat have a lot of negative health impacts. And that's definitely something that's grown the last few years. And so I think we can strongly argue that reduction in red and processed meat will have multiple health benefits. And so regardless of whether you're following a Mediterranean, plant-based, vegetarian, or vegan, that is one of the benefits you see, is because you reduce your intake of red and processed meat. We know that fish and seafood has a variety of different health benefits, but most typically coming from fatty fish that has the healthy omega-3 fats in it. For some people, it can be hard to achieve that amount even when they are consuming fish in their diet. People who follow vegetarian or vegan diets can still achieve health benefits. It will depend on if there's any clinical reasoning to go down the path of supplementing with omega-3. So for example, it may be relevant in areas where people need to reduce inflammation or they have hypertriglyceridemia. That can be, there's evidence to support use of fish oil supplements. So I guess the main thing is that if someone is following those dietary principles, including reduction in red meat, but not necessarily the fish and seafood, they are still likely to achieve a lot of health benefits from following that dietary approach. And it will still be high in polyphenols.
Fantastic. Just a really quick one, Wolf, we've had a few people asking for the details of the course that you mentioned. So I'm not sure if you could remind people or send a link in the chat maybe about where they can find that, because we just had a couple of people asking where they can find those details for that course.
Yeah, sure. So I think probably the easiest in this format is it's food and mood is the topic. It's hosted by FutureLearn. And I think if you probably put food and mood, FutureLearn in Google, it'll probably be the top result.
Great. I think that's a nice, easy way to do it. I think we just have time for one quick last question that I'll pose to both of you, knowing that the Australian Dietary Guidelines are about to be updated. Do you have any thoughts about what you think most needs to change, or what you'd most like to see change in that update of the Australian Dietary Guidelines? I'll throw to you first, Hannah, and then Wolf, if you could finish on that one, and then I'll just quickly close it up for everyone.
Yeah, so I think it aligns well with what I talked about in our current sort of Australian Guide to Healthy Eating core food groups. What I would like to see shift is some division within those core food groups. So no longer putting meat and alternatives together, but having, red meat separate to things like fish and nuts and legumes. That's one key example that I think we will see shift, hopefully based on where the evidence has led us.
Fabulous. And you, Wolf?
Yeah, I actually don't have too much to add. I think the shift that they're seeing more towards, this sort of food-based and dietary pattern approach, I think is welcomed and needed, and it's sort of away from that more sort of macronutrient, micronutrient sort of approach. So no, I think it's all heading in the right direction.
And Sian, I will just add, the other key thing is that we don't want the fats and oils out of the picture anymore. We want and so I think that is going to be hopefully a big shift, because that's where we've gained a lot of knowledge of the health benefits of additional fats and oils like extra virgin olive oil.
Yes, absolutely agree with that one. Well, thank you both. We have gone over time. Apologies for that, but I think it was really valuable to have that question time in there as well. But once again, I just really do want to thank everyone who's joined us today. And of course, a big thank you to our amazing guest speakers, Dr. Wolfgang Marx and Dr. Hannah Mayr. I hope everyone has learned something new today and enjoyed yourself. We'd also like to say, if you haven't already, please check out the website, olivewellnessinstitute.org. We have a huge amount of information on all things olive products. There's lots of recipes and blogs and research on there as well. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. We do have a second webinar in this 3-part series coming up next month that will focus on women's health, including the role of the Mediterranean diet and extra virgin olive oil in reproductive conditions such as endometriosis and polycystic ovarian syndrome. So we'll have the registration link for that webinar in the post-event email, so watch out for that. Finally, we do have a really quick survey. It's only 6 questions that we'd be so grateful if you could please complete following this webinar. It really does help us make sure that we're providing you with content and webinars and events that are relevant to you and useful. So that's all from me. Thank you so much for everyone for attending, and thanks again to Dr. Hannah Mayr and Dr. Wolfgang Marx. And I hope everybody has a lovely day. Thank you so much. Bye.